Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a tortoiseshell cat in pastels. Now this video is going to be packed full of lots of tips on how to draw this very unique fur colouring, but first of all I want to start off with the eyes. Now with any eye colour that is particularly vibrant, I like to make sure that I've captured that, and to start with here I'm always working with my vibrant colours first and then darkening them up in stages. This would be my first biggest tip when working with any bright eye colour. Now the other is, which I have done here, is if you do have a particularly bright highlight in the eye, then it's always worth putting a little bit of white pastel in first for that. That ensures then that we've got that highlight as bright as it can possibly be, and we can darken it later if needed. Now as well as the eye colour, I'm always wanting to focus on capturing the sphere shape of the eye. This is going to add a lot more depth and shaping to the eye and make them more realistic. So you can see here that I've got that shadow at the top part of the eye. That is eventually going to be where the fur on the top of the eyelid is just cast in that shadow, and it helps to make that eye look more three-dimensional. Now what I want to also be focusing on is if there is any subtle shading around the edges of the eye. So you can see here that I'm coming in with a combination of my yellow ochres and my brown pencils to darken just slightly the sides of the eye as well. Now you can also see here that the shadow at the top of the eye, I started with a darker base foundation, but it wasn't black. I made sure to use a bit more of a muted darker green and then added my black to it. This just ensures then that I can still capture some of the colour even though it is darker and not as vibrant, but that I do still have some of that there that I can then darken up later. So it's all very much about the layering process, and this will have to be adjusted depending on the eye colour, but if any of the eyes that you're drawing are vibrant or particularly light in colour, then I would always use these layering techniques that I'm using here. Now when it came to working on the fur that was around the eyes, this is where I was really paying attention to more of the pencil technique and how those layers needed to be built up. Now my first tip when drawing fur like this, where we've got vibrant colours such as this orange next to a darker section of fur like the black, is that we want to be making sure that those colours are kept separate. Now we don't want there to be any harsh edges between the two colours because that's going to make the fur look flat. You can see here that when I come in with my darker oranges, those redder tints and the browns, that I am going to be hinting at a softness between where the two colours meet to avoid that harsh line, but I don't want the two colours to actually mix. So it's really important here that we're using the right pencil technique and we're keeping those layers nice and clean. Now this is something that I do focus thoroughly in the real-time step-by-step version. Because this is a tutorial where I've created that voiceover while I'm drawing, everything is explained in the moment. So if you are interested in this real-time tutorial or any of my other step-by-step lessons, then I will link all of the information to those in the description below. Now when I'm working on the fur here, where it's more of those browns up against the oranges, I'm able to mix those two sections where the colours meet a little bit more. But you can see here that when I'm darkening it, I'm adding those darker values on top. Whereas when I work with the orange up against those black sections of fur, I'm making sure to keep those sections of colour separated. Now as I continue through this portrait, I'm going to share more of those tips on how to keep those vibrant colours more clean and avoid those muddy layers. But for the most part here, I'm always focusing on good contrast. So even though I need to be really careful that I don't mix that black in with the oranges, I want to still be making sure that that black fur is dark enough. So here you can see that I've actually applied these two sections of colour at individual times. I haven't used my pan pastels here for my base layer because I didn't want any part of that darker pastel to accidentally blend over into the area of the orange fur. So this is why I've decided to use my pastel pencils from start to finish for the cat. I did use pan pastels for the background, which if you would like to see a separate video on how I did that blue background, then let me know in the comments below and I'm more than happy to make that. But as I continue to now start building up some of the details, this is again where I need to be making sure that I don't accidentally transfer some of that black pastel into the orange layers. So making sure that the pencil is always clean is really important, and again this is something that I do focus thoroughly in the real-time version of this portrait. but I want to be making sure that regardless of how I'm using my pencils, that I'm still achieving maximum depth. I want to make sure that that colour saturation is still vibrant, that I'm capturing the variation between my pencil strokes to make sure I'm replicating the length of fur, the thickness of the fur, and the direction of the fur. Now those three things are determined by how we use the pencil. So in terms of how sharp the lead needs to be, how much pressure we put on the pencil, how we hold and move the pencil are all factors that are really important. Now I will speak more about the importance of pencil technique in the next few minutes, but the first thing here is, and this is my next tip, is when working on orange fur, we need to be making sure that we've established the bulk of that colour saturation at the base layer stage. Now the reason I feel this is so important is because if we start off with a bit more of a muted base layer and everything's a little bit too light, then as we add those vibrant oranges on top, it's going to mix in to some degree with that lighter pastel and then give us more of a pale look to that orange. So making sure that we've got that vibrancy at a base layer stage, I feel makes the drawing process much easier in the long run. Now how vibrant that base layer needs to be is going to depend on the reference photo that we're working from. You can see that there are sections around the eye here that have more of that lighter pale orange, and that's okay because the fur there isn't too vibrant. But if I was working with a reference photo where the cat was in a little bit more of a shadowed area, the orange didn't have that vibrancy, then the layering process would need to be adjusted. Now when building up these layers, the pencil technique, how we're moving and holding the pencil, as I've mentioned previously, is important, and I'm going to cover that aspect when I work on the neck here. But for the time being, working on the ears, I really want to be focusing on the shape of the ear and capturing that first. So this again is where working on the right layer at the right time is really important. Now when drawing upright ears, this would be the same for a dog or a cat. I want to be making sure that I've actually got the skin portion drawn first. Now usually you can see where the longer hairs are that are sitting in front and on the very top, that they've got sections of either a darker red, a pink. It's going to depend on the lighting, but that colour in between is the skin behind the hair. So that's what I want to be drawing first. Now I'm going to be applying this pastel in a very quick way in that I'm just looking to get something that's very, very smooth and well blended. I'm using a cotton bud there just to achieve that blend even more. Now once I've done that and I've got my layer dark enough, I can then come in with my midtones and my highlights to hint at any of those lighter shades, maybe the light that's coming through the back of the ear, hitting the front of the ear, and just helping with creating more of that shape and form. Now it's really important here, as always, that we don't add highlights or shadows where they're not needed. So making sure that we're following that reference photo accurately is really important. Now for the time being, I have decided to just work on the fur that surrounds the ear because this is behind. Now I like to be working on the order of what's further away first and then building up from there. It's just the way that I feel makes that artwork look more natural. So because this fur is behind the ear, I can add this in, soften that out as much as needed, and then I can work on the ear and pull those details over the top. This just helps to add more of that three-dimensional look to the drawing. Now as I start building up the fur here on the base of the ear, I'm being really careful not to bring in any of that black from the marking next to it into my pencil strokes. Now the one thing here that we have to be careful of is that we don't actually make those pencil strokes look too harsh because we're deliberately trying to avoid the black marking next to it. I still want it to touch the black because it needs to fade into those lighter details. I don't want there to be a harsh start and stop point because the fur will start to look more two-dimensional. It will potentially also look a bit wiry. So that is something that I really want to avoid here. This fur must look soft in order to look realistic. So I need to be making sure that I'm using those pencils correctly to prevent that darker pastel from being mixed into those pencil strokes. And keeping the tip of the pencil clean there is one of the ways to do that. But again, this is something that I do focus thoroughly in this real-time tutorial. Now if you've seen many of my other YouTube videos, you'll know that I like to work in small sections, and this here is one of those portraits where I find that it's been really beneficial to work that way. This is quite a complex and potentially overwhelming fur texture and fur coloration to draw. So I feel that just by breaking it up into small sections, doing one bit at a time, is one way that we can just give that one section our sole attention. We don't then get stressed by the rest of the drawing, and we can then work through it in much more of an effective way. Now, another reason why I prefer working in smaller sections is because, let's say I had got to this stage of the drawing and I wanted to put the pencils down and have a break. I wanted to just look at it with fresh eyes the following day. It's already looking like that photograph and it's looking realistic. So this for me is one of those things that makes it far more motivational to get back to that portrait, and especially when it's something as complex as this, I find that that's something that can make a real difference. Now, one other thing that's important when drawing any animal that has an upright ear position is to check the light source. Now, this is something that we should be paying attention to throughout any parts of the drawing, but with the ears here, this is one of those things that can help establish whether or not we've got a one-sided light source. Now, the lighting in this reference photo was more generalised. It didn't have a strong one-sided light source as such, but the ear on the right-hand side is darker than the ear on the left. So that there is going to give a real visual indication as to whether or not there is a subtle difference in that light source, and it can just help then with how bright something needs to be on one side compared to the next. Because what we can end up doing when working on small sections is just getting fixated with that one area, and we can then accidentally either just make our highlights too bright or our shadows too dark. So when we are working on small sections, it's important to always take the time to look at the entire reference photo to make sure that we're not generalising the values that we're drawing. Now, at the beginning of this video, I briefly mentioned the importance of pencil technique. Now, when working on the area of the fur that surrounds the nose and the mouth area, we want to be making sure that we are adjusting our pencil technique accordingly. Now, the one thing here that I always focus on is the importance of shortening our pencil strokes. Now, if the pencil strokes for this section of the fur are the same length as the fur on the rest of the face, then the muzzle area is going to look too fluffy. Now, in most cases, the fur here around the nose of the cat is going to be significantly shorter than that on the rest of the face and the body. So making sure that we're adjusting the pencil technique here is one of those things that is really, really important. Now, as I'm continuing to block in my main lights and darks, this is the same concept that I've been using throughout the top section of the portrait. I want to be making sure that I'm getting that separation between the orange fur and the darker fur. But the difference here is there's no real harsh separation between the lights and the darks. Everything is just that much more softer between the two sections where they meet. So here I'm not having to have so much of that importance of making sure that those colours are entirely separate, like the markings between the eyes, but I still want to be making sure that I don't drag any of that darker pastel into that lighter orange, because that black will mix in with those lighter colours and the fur will end up with more of a greyish, muddy look to it, which of course we want to avoid. Now onto this last section of the portrait, and here I'm still using my pastel pencils for the same reasons that I mentioned earlier, but I want to be making sure here that I am pinpointing where the orange fur is and where the darker fur is, with the difference that I am going to have more of a soft blended transition between the dark colour into the orange colour. As you can see here, that softness is more visible than the base layer I started with on the face. Now, the only reason for this difference is because the fur is significantly longer here, and it will get longer as we work lower down on the neck. So making sure that I've got a little bit more of that blended, softer effect is going to help with this different fur texture. Now, my next tip for drawing fur like this is to focus on the shapes that you see. Now, this was the case when working on the shorter fur on the face, but when the fur gets longer, it has a bit more of that freedom of movement to curve and change direction, and I want to be making sure that I've captured that. Now, fur that is longer, that does overlap other sections of fur, does become more confusing in terms of what layer should be drawn first. So by focusing on the shapes that we see for the right layer at that time can make it much easier to simplify the entire drawing process. Now this layer here with the lighter orange pencil is a great demonstration of that. What I'm doing here is just focusing on the shapes that that next lighter layer of fur are creating. The way that the length of the fur is and how it curves is just my main priority. I'm ignoring all of the details and the fur that is sitting above this layer. Now once I've established that for this section of the fur, I can then add in another layer if I need to, and that will help to then push down this current layer of fur and help to increase the depth. But if the wrong layer is added too soon and those top details are added in earlier on, it can make the entire process far more complicated because we're almost then ignoring the layers underneath which help with increasing the depth. So here I'm coming in with that white pencil and then adding in another layer of highlights. Now one thing here when using a white pencil over the top of the layers is depending on how that pencil is used and primarily the pressure that's applied, we can actually then just use it to lighten the layer underneath and tint those details. It doesn't necessarily have to make that fur look white. Now the more pressure you apply, the more of that white is going to get transferred and grip to the tooth of the paper. So of course those pencil strokes will look brighter. But if we're adjusting that pressure and easing off that pressure where needed, we can use a white pencil to just lighten what's existing and what's already there. Now regardless if I'm drawing the brown fur here or the orange fur, I'm always wanting to capture the layers of subtlety. Now this is something that I talk a lot about in all of my videos because I feel that this adds so much more extra depth. I never like to add in my brightest highlights on top of my darker base foundation because it makes those highlights look quite flat. It can also make the fur look wiry. So by building up more of the midtones, I think it really helps with capturing more of that softer fur texture. Now the fur direction is going to change quite quickly here in a couple of directions. Now the reason for that is because this is now going over the top of where the shoulder blade is. So the fur direction is not random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So by making sure that we have replicated any of those main changes in fur direction, we are going to again add more shape and form to the drawing. Now when working with any fur texture, the three things here which I've already mentioned previously but it's really important is the fur length, the fur thickness and fur direction. And this brings me on to another tip which I think is really important when drawing any kind of fur, and that's that when we do have these multiple changes of fur direction, that we're not making our pencil strokes too long. Now I think when the fur does change direction as often as it is here, we may have a tendency then to drag that pencil across the paper for a longer period of time than what's actually necessary. Now in the long run what that can create is a bit more of that spaghetti look to the fur, more individual stringy strands rather than this softer fur that we're trying to capture. So making sure that we are studying the direction and the length of the pencil strokes together is really important. Now the thickness of the pencil strokes is determined by a couple of different factors. The first is how sharp the lead is, the other is how much pressure we're applying to the pencil, and then lastly how we're moving the pencil. Now as you can see from this section here, I don't often work with very sharp pencils. As long as the right technique is used, you can use blunt pencils and still create lovely fine details. The way that we're holding and moving the pencil usually has more of an impact. Now there are times when I will sharpen my pencil to a fairly sharp point, but that's usually going to be for very delicate, tiny little details, potentially some very thin whiskers, but even then, a blunt pencil, as long as you're using the right technique, can work just as well. Now a big tip that can really help when drawing any kind of fur, if you are finding that your pencil strokes are not thin enough, is to make sure that you're not using too much pressure. This can also be impacted with how you're holding the pencil. Now you can see here that most of the time I'm at least 1.5 inches away from the lead, if not holding it in the middle of the pencil. Now there are no rules on exactly how you should hold the pencil, but as a general guideline I like to hold the pencil about halfway up the lead if I'm going to be creating a longer line, and that's going to help with, as I say, that lighter pressure. If I am creating shorter, more delicate details, then I will typically hold it much closer to the lead, but I won't be gripping right by the lead itself. I never hold my pencils like that. That's one of the biggest causes for creating those thicker and potentially more grainy lines, because of how that pencil and the pressure is applied down the lead. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I would be very, very grateful. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if you are interested in drawing along to this real-time tutorial of this beautiful cat, then I will link all of the information to that in the description as well. I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.